All right, we're at PT number 5 of the 2024 TOK season, and this prescribed title is arguably the shortest prescribed title that Ivy has ever written. Thank you, Ivy people. And it goes as follows: do we need custodians of knowledge? Interestingly, this PT also is not pinned down to an area of knowledge. So today, myself and the panelists will try to kind of fairly touch upon every area. If there's any interested TOK student out there that may want to write on this topic. Going through the panel quickly, my far right is Ms. Blake, conveniently our school librarian. Thank you, Ms. Blake. We've got TOK senior Pedro. Thank you, Pedro. TOK teacher, Mr. Barton. Myself, the TOK teacher, Mr. Johnson. Naya. And Sanyas. All right, so today, to get started, we do have a short PT. And typically, we need to define our terms. We have a few interesting ones, like the pronoun actually was a bit curious. I also never have seen that in an IB PT as far as I can remember. This we. Also, need as the key verb here. What type of need is this prescribed title wanting us to think about? Is it a purely intellectual need, or is it a very down-to-earth practical need? We might want to think about different types of needs, but most crucially is the key word custodian. And so for the purposes of today's discussion, we might have 3 different versions of custodian, 3 different meanings. And the first one is pretty natural. It's custodian as a caretaker. So we might think of a teacher or a parent, someone who wants to nurture you, and as the metaphor goes, nurture knowledge. Let water the plant of knowledge, let it grow and blossom, evolve. This language is in Star Wars too. I found an example, the Council of First Knowledge. They consider themselves the caretakers of first knowledge. And these custodians in the Star Wars universe, they have a job of setting the curriculum for the younglings in the Jedi Temple and such things. So this is kind of people on the inside of a field. They're in the know. And again, they're kind of worried about the continuity of knowledge, making sure it's preserved and expanded upon and taught properly, and these types of things. So that's one meaning of custodian. But there's another meaning, maybe the meaning that many of us would gravitate towards, which is kind of a gatekeeper, which can have a negative connotation, but also it can have a very, very positive connotation. And this is often the role of librarians, archivists, all sorts of individuals that care about, in particular, the integrity of knowledge and its dissemination, how it's properly disseminated, and kind of preserving not just the knowledge itself, but the standards we use to judge and produce knowledge. And as we all know, in the information age, this role in itself is changing in interesting ways with the onset of artificial intelligence and social media, and all sorts of other technological gatekeeping mechanisms that might come into our discussion. Okay, so that's meaning number 2 of custodian. And then finally, an American like myself, I hear this word on the street. We might first think of a janitor, actually, a maintenance worker, a cleaner, which seems kind of academically irrelevant, but it's not. Because my background and Mr. Barton's is philosophy, and the whole last century of philosophy, at least within the analytic school of thought, has kind of revolved around this very idea of seeing problems in natural human language and thinking like, before we try to solve this problem or take it seriously, maybe we need to clean it up a little bit. Maybe we need to be more hygienic with our language, use the right words, phrase it properly, understand the argument behind what we're asking and the arguments that follow. In short, the logic. So logic, for those that go on to study, is typically very hygienic in its nature. So this is a third and very different, again, very different meaning of custodian. So cool, so even though this PT is very short and sweet and simple, and many people should choose it, deep down it's fairly complicated because we've got this rich kind of constellation of meanings, and we should try to be careful about which one we're referring to when we're thinking about custodianship. All right, I'm going to stop talking soon, but I want to get the panelists going by referring to this quite famous and notorious case in the history of science in the past 50 years. And it goes back to this physics professor from New York University, down the street from us, named Alan Sokol, who once successfully published a paper in a cultural studies journal proposing a new theory of gravity, quantum gravity, that comes with all of these convenient cultural interpretations. He quite compellingly argues that the future theory of physics actually lines up really nicely and gives support to all of these progressive political movements, especially on the far left and these types of things. All right, so long story short, this dude, Alan Sokol, by the way, physics professor, very smart, he's got the degree and everything. He successfully publishes his paper, and it turns out this journal doesn't really have a peer review process. This is kind of reason number one how this could possibly happen. There's a few other variables on the table, but ultimately 2-3 weeks go by, and Professor Sokol says, haha, gotcha. This was a joke, this was a hoax. And as a good teacher, he thought he was delivering a lesson. The lesson being, we need to be more cognizant of our integrity and these standards that we might be losing sight of in some of these journals. Okay, so that's one side of the story. Usually this story is framed in the way I just said, where, okay, the physics professor taught humanities people a lesson, which already should set off alarms to people, because the natural sciences have a tendency of doing that, of being kind of arrogant towards the human sciences. So, not so fast, Professor Sokol. There might be more to the story. And the other side of it is maybe, just maybe, Professor Sokol in this instance was being kind of aggressively gatekeeping. After all, he published not in a physics journal, but in a humanities journal. And not just a humanities journal, a cultural studies journal, which is open to kind of really exploring new interpretations and new ways of thinking. I went to the #1 source to knowledge online, Reddit. Don't take that seriously, TOK students. But a random human being on Reddit did make this claim that Professor Sokol was aggressively short-sighted in this kind of gatekeeping that ultimately hurts academia and research overall. And this Redditor went on to say that he thinks Sokol's legacy in social science is to be that guy, the one who assures people that it's okay to refuse to have conversations about confusing differences. All right, so to get us going, I just want to ask the panelists quickly. This can be brief, as long as you want. To what extent do you agree with that view, the kind of backside of this story? To what extent do you agree with this Reddit guy that's saying, you know what? Maybe he wasn't completely correct in committing this hoax. Maybe he was too aggressive in his approach, or even wrong-headed in his approach. What do you think, Sam?
Well, I think if we were to support that argument,
yeah.
There is a denotation made to being a custodian and having possession, and I think with that comes power. So I think this argument would support an abuse of power, and well, you could say that he outsmarted his audience in, I guess, convincing a few of them in the content that he was putting out. But I think ultimately what that claim was arguing is that there was an abuse of power, and I think when we say, do we need custodians of knowledge, there's also something to be said about verifying that knowledge and making sure that it's being, I guess, let out into the world in, through a process, and there are procedures and rules, which I guess this journal was lacking.
Okay. So you do partly agree with the view of this writer?
I see their point,
Yeah.
I do partially agree with that.
Okay. Naya?
I think the key word was the fact that it was a cultural journal. A cultural journal implies the fact that all cultures are different from one another. So by definition, it can't have like a strict like guideline of what can be published and what can't. Maybe the reason that there isn't a peer reviewing thing in this journal is the fact that a culture is so personal to someone that it can be subject to such a review. And of course, peer review does help make it more valid, but I also think it also hinders someone's ability to talk about their own culture. So I understand where this person is coming from, because I think there is a difference between human science and natural science for a reason. There's a difference between culture for a reason. A culture is so personal that it can't be bound to guidelines. And so I think that what he's trying to prove here is not valid because of where it was published.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Mr. Barton?
I'm going to say I do kind of agree with what Naya's saying. I think that cultural studies is a place where we don't want to be too exclusive about what counts as knowledge, because that runs the risk of being exclusive of perspectives. But I think one place where I differ is that I don't think it was that they didn't have a peer review process. What I understood is that it was just shoddy, and the people who were in charge with checking that journal really weren't reading things properly, or were accepting of the idea, I don't understand this, but it must be okay, I'm just going to publish it. What I fear is happening is that when we're all short of time, there's just, okay, that'll do, I think it sounds good, or it fits with what I like to hear, so we'll just go ahead and pass it without really understanding. If they'd understood it, they would have seen it was kind of nonsense.
All right. Adrian?
I was thinking maybe in this case we're treating him as a custodian of knowledge because he was the only one who wrote about it and who didn't ask him of anyone else. However, if he had asked like peers to review his paper, maybe he would pass on this custody to the peers, so no matter where or who, there would still be custodians of knowledge, whether that might be him or the peers. I also think that, guiding towards what Naya was saying, maybe like having too much of a peer review might create a bureaucratic process into developing knowledge. So maybe if maybe there are some clashing opinions or some clashing even facts, maybe when peers are reviewing, and this might block a paper to go to the public, and then for other people to add their opinions. This might just be a bureaucracy that might hinder knowledge at the end of the day. While I also get Mr. Barton's view on how letting every kind of knowledge go free in the world might also be dangerous. So I think there's both sides for these.
Okay. And Ms. Blank?
Ms. Blake read the title of that article and immediately rolled her eyes at the use of the word hermeneutics, which has to do with interpreting biblical texts. That has no business being anywhere near quantum gravity. So I think that Professor Skokol was making a valid point, but he was so condescending about it. And I understand that there should be absolute back and forth discussion and welcoming of different perspectives in a number of areas of life where we are able to bring those perspectives. There are some physical principles of science that might not be as, maybe not quite as testable. Like when there was a remark about, well, you know, if you want to check quantum gravity, come over to my balcony on the 21st floor. And your test of quantum gravity will go very much farther than one time only. So I think that there is a need for a peer review process to save the reputation of the journal, as well as to validate knowledge, so that if it is part of a wide range of knowledge and interpretations that can be tested and validated, then we broaden the collective understanding. That's absolutely essential. But unfortunately, the lack of rigorous peer review actually hurt the journal more than the practical, maybe even the professor thought with his somewhat of a practical joke. He was being condescending. And I think he probably thought, well, they must have a safety process in place, so this couldn't possibly be published because it's so, I'm writing things that should just leap out of them. So there was probably an assumption that there was a standard, such as in the standard in which, the area in which he would publish papers in physics.
I just want to write one thing. I agree that he was absolutely condescending, but I think just for a counterpoint, it is also quite funny. If you read it, it's funny. It's like brilliant nonsense.
Yeah, he did it in a way where there's a certain coherence, like it wasn't complete babble.
But then it's plausible, and that's where we have to be very careful, because if it sounds just plausible enough, and we think, oh, he's an accomplished physicist, I don't know that much about physics, God, he must know what he's saying, okay. That's the real gray zone, where you don't want to look foolish, you don't want to maybe say something to somebody who may well indeed know way more than you, and then he can condescend further to you. So it's something that it really does make the validation of knowledge even more important, not just for us speaking in this room, but for every single student all over the world. They need to go through exercises like this, and they need to understand the value of peer review and how knowledge is validated, both so that we contain misinformation, but also so that we have proper standards so that we actually allow people to make valid points that really actually, disprove bad information, further validate the information that we have, and allow more people to participate in this process. Because I know it's gatekeeping, I know it's custodial, but this is also directly connected to a vibrant democracy and to, the advancement of human civilization.
Just a question, has no one ever claimed him wrong until he said that he was wrong?
No one's possible.
Yeah, he waited about, it was just a few weeks.
Oh, okay.
He waited a few weeks. He wanted to make sure it was actually published and appeared in print, and then he did his gotcha moment. Yeah. Cool. Well, I figure we're already in the human sciences, and I know some of the students here like to think about the human sciences, and I was shopping around for other examples. So this might be an example where it seems like our consensus is yes, he was a bit condescending, it was a bit kind of aggressive in his approach, but ultimately it kind of pointed out a serious flaw and a lack of a sufficiently good peer review system, all sorts of related things. Shopping around the human sciences for an example of something more on the opposite side is the case of psychology with this one psychologist, Lacan, who is a controversial figure in itself, but nonetheless what happened to him in his career is quite interesting for the purposes of this PT. And just to tell the panelists quickly, what happened to this psychologist Lacan in France is he was excommunicated, which is a strong word, but pretty truthful. He was removed from the official governing body of psychoanalysis, his field, globally. So the IPA, they call themselves, I believe that they still exist, the International Psychoanalytic Association. And this is the academic governing body that is responsible for lots of things, not only academic integrity and organizing conferences and workshops and all sorts of things, but they really have this profound social role in shaping the trajectory of the field. And the short of this episode is he, as I said, was removed from this organization. And so you can imagine the consequences on a researcher if this happens. And to really emphasize this episode, the reason, ultimately, more or less the single reason why he was rejected and excommunicated from the official governing body of his field, was he had a new method of doing his therapy sessions. So, according to the god of that organization, Freud, every session of therapy had a fixed length, namely 50 minutes. You know, because Freud was so worshipped, of course he knew the exact number of successful therapy. It was 50 minutes. That's what a therapy session needs to involve. And yes, Lacan, if you read his work, says some quite controversial ideas and theories, but nonetheless, this one theory of his that maybe the session doesn't need to be magical 50 minutes. Maybe it can be shorter, maybe it can be longer. Turned out a lot of Lacan sessions were on the shorter side, which he got in trouble for. But nonetheless, his main idea here that turned out to be unacceptable was that a therapy session could be any length of time. That more or less one idea got him kind of kicked out, excommunicated from the official governing body. So here's a case where we have custodians making such a drastic decision that could really dictate the rest of the course of a researcher's career. So maybe, hopefully this will instigate conversation, but initial reactions, does anyone have an initial reaction to this case?
I think that then it's also, as I was saying previously, the abuse of power, and how, in the sense that the aspect of ego probably comes into place, because he simply didn't allow for any debate to happen. He just excommunicated Lacan. So I do believe that also those custodians of knowledge might have to follow some rules. Maybe if they need them, they might have to follow some rules. They might have to follow some laws that would avoid them to also abuse their power. Otherwise, it just loses the meaning of having a custodian of knowledge, which should be someone that praises knowledge and praises discussions about knowledge. While in this case, apparently, Freud was simply being egotistic in a certain way.
Yeah, I have to interject here because Pedro's making me wonder. Before we started the panel, Pedro was already suggesting that these different roles of custodianship interact in interesting ways. And what Pedro just gave us, it's making me wonder, it's super important to have our principles of integrity and standards in academia, but how do we update those when the world changes, or let alone knowledge changes? And those types of custodians might find themselves kind of limited or stuck in their ways, because after all, it's not so much the purview of what they're responsible for. But interestingly, we have another type of custodian who does care about updating knowledge, namely these caretakers and teachers and stuff like that. And so, yeah, Pedro's making me wonder, like, can other types of custodians help other types of custodians if we need to update the standards themselves? Surely we need to update these standards of integrity also, and not just knowledge itself. So that's a cool thought there, yeah.
Bouncing off what Pedro just said, I find it kind of hypocritical that Freud went against this, because if I'm not wrong, Freud's theories were, most of Freud's theories were based off him going out of the rules of psychology. He created his own rules, but there was no, if people were blocking his ideas, then he would have never had this doctrine that he's now promoting. So it makes me wonder, if Freud was given that freedom and came up with discoveries that may have had some ethical violations, but at the end it did lead to massive discovery in psychology, then shouldn't other psychologists have that same kind of freedom? Yeah. And I get your point about there needing to be moral ethics need to be present while making these theories, but also should other psychologists be limited? And psychologists like Freud almost had little to no limitations.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And also something that I was thinking about is how, why with Lacan, he totally condemned his new perspective. One of his precursors, one of his followers, Carl Jung, he openly had an affair with one of his patients, and even though this went against everything that Freud apparently claimed for his methodology, he did not condemn Jung as much as he did with Lacan. So once again, I think that this interplay between power and And yeah, mostly this thing about power might hamper how custodians of knowledge should properly act.
Yeah. Any more? Yeah, Ms.
Well,
Blake.
we are talking about humans too when we talk about therapy. When we need to think about patient safety, and I think it was not outrageous for that psychoanalyst
Yeah.
to say, oh no, you can't solve every problem in 50 minutes given how complex human beings might be. And if we didn't have some argument about how therapy was conducted, maybe we wouldn't have a lot of the benefits that we have now about how trials are conducted, how patient safety is safeguarded, how different forms of therapy may be proven to be much more effective or much less effective and potentially harmful. And there is a certain responsibility with custodians who are running an organization to make sure that their personal and political biases are kept in control and do not overly influence what power they wield, because they may make decisions, we can all say that in nice theoretical terms, but they do wield power when they make those decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I wonder, we've floated around the human sciences quite a bit already, which naturally bleed into natural sciences, and we did talk about Professor Sokol and physics. The same, when we turn to natural sciences, we do see, unfortunately, the same phenomena happening all the time. And interesting people, because we are kind of focused on the researchers themselves in this PT, interesting people here might be the kind of spokespersons, the spokespeople of natural science, which in the current age, we have quite a number of spokespersons. There's Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye and Richard Dawkins and all men, of course. And now that I look at that list, yeah. But yeah, these people that are not only practicing natural scientists, but they deeply, deeply care about the discipline, so much so that they take to the streets, as it were, and they kind of inspire students that aren't even students yet, and they kind of represent the field in the most accessible way possible. So that's, if anything's caretaking, that definitely strikes me as being caretakers. But again, there's a backside to all these things, because what does Peter Parker say, Spider-Man say? With great power comes great responsibility. Did I quote that right? Okay. So, remembering Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, yeah, these people often say things that are a bit too simplistic, perhaps don't rightfully capture the complexity of the knowledge itself. But there's always a trade-off there, because after all, they're trying to kind of attract a non-specialist or a new student to the field. So they do have to make sacrifices in presenting the work to the general public. So that was just kind of my example of custodians in natural science, these types of people. How do we, back to the language of our PT, do you guys think we need these people? After all, we thankfully do have a number of them in our current culture. But how important are they, and do they sometimes cause trouble?
Well, so before coming here, we were discussing maybe some examples that I would bring. And something that we thought about was the figure of the Pope, as how he is a caretaker of knowledge, because he takes care, like a teacher, he takes care of the Bible, and following his opinions in a certain way, the Catholic population would learn from what he believes and from what his interpretations of the Bible are.
Yeah.
So in this sense, it might be, of course, it's helpful to have such big figure helping to understand such complex language. However, it might also hinder other opinions to come to place. So it might also hinder these debates. But then, so in this sense, I think that maybe the figure of the Pope might be too might, I don't know, maybe be abusing the power he would have when it enforces the Catholic population to follow his interpretations. But then, Naya, as a Muslim person, she was talking to me about the Quran. So maybe you want to talk about how this is introduction.
It's a lot differently to the Catholic religion. In Islam, there is no central figure. So what happens often is when there are interpretations floated around, there is no one to verify what is true and what's not. And of course, there is no custodian. So what happens then is everyone has their own interpretation. But then that brings an argument, should there be a custodian in religion? Because in one sense, that means that all people kind of follow the same interpretation and it's easier to verify. Whereas in, like, if there's no custodian, everyone has their own interpretation, and that leads to, I think, a lot of internal fighting. But it also leads people to have a more personal connection with their own religion, because it depends on what they think is right. So I think it really depends on which side you see.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Yeah, especially if we can put more religions on the table too. I mean, you guys are reminding me, in Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is famously very open to Western science, and physics in particular. And back to updating our standards too, like you guys are mentioning how in Catholicism versus Islam, we get these different types of custodianship. But again, back to this question of like updating our standards too. Like it seems like a religion like Tibetan Buddhism seems to be quite good about updating doctrine and standards, you know, with respect to other AOKs, you know, like, but it's interesting where they draw the lines too, because if you listen to the Dalai Lama, what's really interesting here, I wonder if you guys have thoughts here, but Western physics, he's completely open to it, which is to say Tibetan Buddhism in general is open to Western physics. But psychology, not so much. Because, after all, Tibetan Buddhism has things to say about human psychology. Deep, deep theories that are often in opposition to some Western psychological theories. And so that's an interesting dividing line he and the community there draws between AOKs. And he's doing this as a custodian too, as a bit of a gatekeeper. So how do we feel about that division between AOKs? More or less complete openness to physics. Teach us everything there is to learn about physics. We'll accept it insofar as we understand it and believe it. But psychology, Western psychology, keep that away from us. We have our own theories and we're quite compelled by them. So how does that sit with you guys?
The first thing I thought was that Scientology is also famously very opposed to psychology, and that's definitely their number one target. They see them as the number one rivals. I'm not aware what Scientology is. It's a religion, sort of, debatable whether it counts as one, invented by someone who was a science fiction writer, and a science fiction writer who realized that he could do quite well financially out of creating a religion. Don't sue me, but yeah. And yeah, they attack psychologists more than anything, because I think just because they see it as their territory. And I think religion, in the past, you saw these conflicts with the natural sciences, biologists who had a conflicting story about the origin of the earth, but it seems like they've ceded that territory now to the natural sciences. But so it's still in the realm of psychology that they want to debate. So I see it as a territorial battle.
It is a territorial battle because you worry about the interpretation being so strict and unchanging that it turns tyrannical. I personally don't appreciate the Bible saying that, you know, the problems of the world, that's the fault of the women. That's Eve's fault. I have no time for that.
Yeah.
I think custodians have, especially in religion, they're under both great responsibility but terrible pressure to present a faith, to keep it pure so that it is not manipulated, so that it does not promote hurtful ideas that other people who are not of the same belief system would then suffer. The current Pope is for the Catholic Church, an extremely open-minded man, and his biggest problems come from within the church orthodoxy itself. There are many people who aspire to keep the church in the same power structure with the same worldview and keeps people in there's certain roles that were described to us over 2,000 years ago, and for all the good that the current pope can do in his role, he is terribly circumscribed or just hemmed in by keeping the more orthodox interpreters of the Catholic faith under some kind of civilized behavior control.
But doesn't it also hamper their expression of religion? Maybe the Roman Orthodox, or not even the Orthodox Catholicism might have a different approach, and because of course the Orthodox do not obey to the Pope, but because the Pope is such like a big figure, this might also put Orthodox views as subdued to what the Pope decides. Of course, it's great that he's open-minded. As a Catholic myself, I'm super proud of the Pope we have.
Yes.
But maybe enforcing this open-mindedness might also be detrimental to other perspectives. When you think of right and wrong.
Oh yes, I mean, we could certainly turn the situation around, and in a way, I think back into the cultural studies journal, how it, by its mission, tries to promote and respect the voicing of different opinions and perspectives, and then people who don't really buy that kind of worldview of being open-minded find ways to make fun of it, play practical jokes, kind of reduce it to that terrible expression woke, which has now been completely perverted and subverted and is no longer what it originally meant. I think it really comes back to how we, as human beings, how we view power and how we try to both be very clear and focused in our thoughts and try to push collective knowledge forward, but also not be afraid to welcome new perspectives, but let them be tested too for validity. And I think I worry about people who take something like religion and use it to manipulate other people, because now you're not relying on anything concrete. You're actually you're trying to gain somebody's trust through blind faith. All these stories about creation, we don't know how. Scientifically, I think we have a good idea how the world was created. But before you learn that scientific stuff, you might be exposed to a creation story that has absolutely no evidence to back it up, but you're expected to believe it. And so you do. And if you find comfort in religion, that's fantastic. But then if somebody comes in and takes that comfort and trust and faith and then manipulates it, they are not being a good custodian, and then there needs to be some other form within the social structure that can keep excesses in check.
I also find it interesting how, as you were saying previously, in the natural sciences we have this tendency to always be more open to new ideas, because that's how we progress in natural sciences. Whether in the human sciences, like in the field of religion, for example, we tend to follow one perspective or one view in a certain way, but also in a broader field, and in literature, for example, is it necessary? Should it be allowed for some books to be banned, for example? So maybe there are so many countries that Naya was telling me how many countries banned 1984. While there are many countries who did not ban Mein Kampf, for example. So which books can be educational, which books can be purely used as lessons of evil? And if there is such thing, still should we ban those books or should we not? Should we allow for these books to be forms of propelling knowledge forward?
A lot to say there, yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great place to start in terms of discussing this. There's the idea of censorship, the idea of why would we need a custodian of knowledge? What is it about knowledge that needs looking after? And in this case, there's an idea or that certain kinds of knowledge, let's take literature as you mentioned, and somehow dangerous or bad for the welfare of the people in some way, and these ideas can shift. So in a very short time, what was it kind of censored in 1960 might seem fairly normal and perhaps even found in a school library today, and things that in the past might have been seen as absolutely normal, we might find shocking today. So those ethical roles shift. So the question is, how do we deal with that? There's different levels of censorship. You can have an attempt to completely destroy the knowledge forever, kind of erase it, burning the books and try and find every single copy. I think thanks to the internet, that's probably never going to happen. The other is, do we still want to reprint certain things? You know, are we going to spend money to make more copies of something and actively spread around the knowledge? So there's different levels of kind of trying to completely eliminate something from existing. I'm thinking of a slightly different example, but in the UK, where we had this phase of pulling down various statues of people who were considered to have been involved in slavery. There were some people who came out to defend their statues, saying that it was part of history and that people were trying to eliminate history. And the counter argument was, well, the history is still there. We'll leave a plaque saying this person's there. We just don't want to celebrate it. So my analogy there is, if, for example, there's a book that is no longer considered ethically correct or politically correct, we don't have to keep reprinting it. It doesn't mean the book isn't going to exist or that people can find it. We're just not promoting it. We're not saying, hey, read this is great. It can still exist without, it's not really active censorship, it's just saying, let's change it. The other thing is that you get some cases where they edit books, and I find that a little bit more complicated, and I'm not really a fan of that, cutting bits out of someone's work. I feel like you should maintain the integrity of the work. Yeah.
But what do you have to own to be in charge of deciding if the statues are going to be taken down or not? Like which kind of knowledge do you have to possess to guide a nation towards these decisions?
I think the interesting thing in this case was that there weren't really custodians. It was the crowd. It wasn't kind of experts going, we're going to pull these statues down. It was a popular movement of these are celebrating slavery, and we don't want to do that. So people were like, let's pull it down. I don't know if we could point at custodians in that case, but in the case of people deciding, like a publishing house, saying we don't want to publish Roald Dahl books completely anymore, we're going to cut bits out, I would kind of rather they just didn't publish them. I love the stories, but I think why they publish them when you don't, and cutting bits out of them isn't right. I don't know, I feel like you shouldn't edit art in that way.
No, and if you provide a wide range of reading, which is what a library likes to do. I mean, I am a custodian. I do curate. There are subjects that may seem maybe a little antiquated or quirky, but I want certain titles to be in the library, so if somebody wants to read them, he or she can. I also want to promote, different forms of political thought. And sure, I don't have any of the pressures of a public school library in this country. I'm really quite, I have a lot of latitude to put a beautiful collection together that I think, would be both enjoyable and edifying to a large number of people in a school community. Yeah, there are definitely some titles I might be a little nervous about, and I'm not so sure about that, but that's the responsibility of a custodian, to think about, go by a set of ethical guidelines. Does this shine a light on some previous history that was terrible, so we know not to repeat it again? Does this provide an alternate perspective? Does this allow a voice that previously was not able to be heard to be heard, and maybe the people who read it can derive some kind of empowerment or knowledge or relief from reading this material?
I kind of wanted to connect this idea of censorship back to history. Like with literature, of course, books being censored, that's kind of, you're trying to not promote an ideology, at least part was kind of implied. But also in history, such terrible things happen, but schools still teach it. So it's kind of like, if this idea can be applied that we don't want to promote an ideology. Is teaching certain events promoting that as well? Or is we learn history to make sure that it doesn't happen again? So by nature, shouldn't ideologies also be allowed to be read so that we can learn not to repeat it again? Like, it's kind of this idea that if maybe someone reads communist thoughts, maybe they can learn from it rather than in a positive way, maybe not in a negative way. The same way in history, when we learn about the atrocities like the Holocaust, we learn how to make sure events like these don't happen again. So shouldn't the same theory kind of be applied to literature as well?
I think that's an interesting point, but in the classroom, teachers tend to openly condemn these events that happen. While in literature, if you go to the primary sources, so if you go and read Mein Kampf, for example, we're reading the opposite. You're reading someone who created the ideology in a certain way. So then I think it creates kind of this paradox. But one thing that I was thinking about is the fact of forgetting, which was a Spanish pact decided by both rightists and leftist politicians that they would not condemn the actions taken by Franco. So that besides everything, besides all the atrocities he committed, he still has a legacy. And I feel like these custodians of knowledge who acted as gatekeepers, then they have an influence on teachers who theoretically act as caretakers by not allowing the teachers to condemn such atrocities. So maybe also there's this broader aspect of how different custodians may affect one another and how this might change how classes are taught or how literature is read. So maybe at the end of the day, does everything boil down to politicians, to the power they hold? Are they the only and the ultimate custodians of knowledge, since apparently everybody else should respond to them?
It's really interesting. I think the forgetting is an important part of moving on, but also addressing wrongs is another way that we move on. And if things are human rights abuses and things like that, then I can understand that there was a broad consensus in this case, which is interesting, but I hadn't thought of this, but it suddenly made me think of Custodians of Knowledge. There's a museum, which I think is an excellent museum in Santiago de Chile, called Museo de la Memoria. It's basically a memory museum, and it's to preserve the record of the abuses that took place. So there are pictures, it's really quite difficult to go. There are pictures of many other people who disappeared during the dictatorship in Chile, and it's an education center as well. People are taken there to learn, and the idea is, they don't want this to just be swept under the carpet and forgotten about. By preserving this memory and keeping this knowledge, it serves a historical function. Maybe some government in the near future, that there is a candidate for government in Chile at the moment is not in power, but may get in power in the near future, who I'm pretty sure would want to shut that museum down and sort of say, let's not talk about the dictatorship anymore, or maybe let's look at the positive side of it and not look at all of the abuses.
Yeah. I just, like, you guys are all making me want to ask you about a third category when it comes to AOK of history and custodians of history. We have this nice balance now where we're seeing the positive events of history and the ones that we want to teach should remain in the textbook. I hear compelling arguments for kind of keeping in these negative traces too, so we don't, classic slogan, we don't repeat our mistakes, and for other reasons. But a few people mentioned this ethical category of forgetting too, and I think we want to kind of think more deeply about this perhaps to end the discussion. Like, historians more than any other AOK have this huge ethical decision in the center of the field of, namely, which bits of the past are we going to record? Because it's a shitload, excuse me, it's a lot. It's a lot. And think about all the mundane things that are seemingly unexciting to us, but maybe in 2067 they would be thrilling. There's so much mundane stuff and seemingly uninteresting things that are just blatantly left out, regardless of the connotation, negative or positive. They're forgotten, like Trump's presidency. That's not so interesting to me, so maybe we'll just leave it out. But we see there's an ethical valence to that for sure. So maybe as a last thought, how do we feel about this middle category of things, again, that are not necessarily intrinsically positive or intrinsically negative, but this big decision historians have to make, and custodians of history, what are we going to put in the textbook?
Like Pedro was mentioning something about politicians being custodians of knowledge, and I think that applies to history as well. Politicians do decide what kind of history gets put out. Like an example of like maybe custodians as janitors is the fact that the US Constitution, it allows for amendments to be made, but it doesn't allow you to take away anything from the Constitution. So doesn't that kind of, I think in that way, and the US I think is a good representation of democracy. So in a democracy, they're allowing for changes to be made to adapt to our world now, but they're also not taking away anything that was made. So back to that point, shouldn't history also kind of be like that, where we make changes, but we also don't delete anything that's happened in the past?
I would say also that there is, for the historians, I think there's not only the decision of what they should focus on, you have to balance that out with politicians who interfere in an attempt to put forth political agendas and see what history will predominate, not just in traditional publishing anymore, but through social media. And then you have, unfortunately, you have money. It's expensive to publish information, good information, so you can't put everything in a textbook, but you could make more, you could make it easier for historians to research and not be subjected to, if you don't sell X number of copies, no publisher is going to pick up what you said. You could have very valuable information, valuable in the sense of humanity, but if it's not valuable financially, that is actually another barrier. And that makes it even more important that historians, and oftentimes they've worked in journalism first, so they've actually lived through part of the history they can write about, but they continue their custodial role to write about the big and the more mundane, smaller topics. Otherwise, I don't think we'd know much about, the massacre in Tulsa in 1921. I don't think we'd know much about the lives of women. I don't think we'd be able to read a book like Killers of the Flower Moon, which is what, the experience of what happened to the Osage people when they were pushed onto a dry patch of Oklahoma territory, and then all of a sudden there was oil found underneath it. So I think we as informed citizens, we're all custodians too if we wish to be. If we're knowledgeable, we can be custodians. We can also keep custodians in check. Because otherwise I don't see how we push the collective knowledge forward so that we avoid having marginalized populations and inequality due to the fact that there's not enough access to what helpful knowledge is, whether it's a wide and accurate history, or it's financial literacy, or it's understanding how algorithms work, or it's understanding the value of reading Tolstoy.
I like that idea of keeping the custodians in check, and going back to the idea of the statues being pulled down, that the people are saying, right, if you're not going to deal with this, we'll pull this down because you're not taking care of this street, and you're leaving this kind of celebration of this person up in the street. So yeah, the people can in some way keep an eye on the custodians and try and watch the watchmen, shall we say. My feeling is, going to the question in a big picture, that we do need custodians of knowledge. Knowledge is everywhere, and there's all sorts of different opinions, and there's all sorts of different amounts of information, but what actually counts as knowledge, I think it's important to look after it, make sure it isn't forgotten. Think about like languages that can go extinct, and of folk music that we need to record and try to look after and preserve for future generations. I think ideas, scientific ideas, all of these things, we've kind of, at this point now, we've entrusted it to the internet and to AI, and that's probably going to be the main custodian in the future. And the question is, who's looking after the algorithms at this point? How do we make sure that that's going to work in our interest?
Right. Well, perhaps we can end on that ominous note. Any last comments?
I
Yeah.
just wanted to add that I think when it comes to deciding the content, what you need to do is start by allowing perspective. And I think, like with Ivy history, for example, we're exposed to different schools of thought, we're exposed to different historians. But I think at the end of the day, what matters is that there's an interdependence between the custodians. So like, for example, if we say a post-revisionist historian and refining the initial content of orthodox views or revisionist views, they kind of take those two together and come with like a general consensus or conclusion if they are the janitors, I guess, if they refine that knowledge.
Yeah.
And then we have the caretakers, I believe, who would be like a history teacher. And I think our history teacher, in introducing us to those different perspectives of the janitor being the post-revisionist or other historical perspectives, there's that relationship there, and we depend on that, like, that coexistence between the two custodians.
Yeah.
And I think that shows the power of those caretakers because they are able to expose us to those views. And that's definitely threatening in a way to, I guess, governments or these entities who hold this, who can be considered custodians of knowledge in a way because they have the power to censor these academics, these outspoken individuals with political views. And I think that shows the power that the caretakers have. And so it also, I think, outlines how all custodians should be interdependent on each other, and when these other custodians allow these perspectives and allow these caretakers to expose us to the multiple perspectives and not solely their own, and when we have that interdependence, that's when I think we grow as students, and we can in fact say that we do need custodians of knowledge simply because we allow different types of custodians to exist together.
Very cool picture. Very cool picture. And I think it goes back to Pedro's insights about interactions between them. And to use now I mentioned American government, I'm picturing kind of a checks and balances, a balanced ecosystem where no one has like the end-all, be-all power. Very cool picture. And the masses themselves, like not only AI, but I think towards the end of our conversation, multiple panelists bring up the fact it's like the statues being torn down. It's the public. It's not one of these minority custodian groups. It's the public's opinion too. So that's another category of custodianship that might be interdependent in that healthy ecosystem. Cool. All right. Well, maybe we can end with that nice picture, and we have just enough time for the huge audience to ask a few questions. Is there anyone out there in this never-ending audience that would want to chime in?
I haven't formulated the question, so good for if you have one.
During the discussion, I was thinking about, like, there's a reference to Western medicine. And I was thinking about how doctors play as custodians of knowledge. Since, like, I was thinking about it, and I realized that doctors, like, they are one of the biggest custodians because they recommend you medicine, and these medicines have such large names, such confusing names, and we don't really know their benefits, and we just take them without any like, with not much questions about them, and I was just wanted to know others' opinions on that.
Great question.
I think my answer to that would be, on one level, we absolutely need custodians, not just as children, but as adults. We don't know, and we can't be expected to know everything. And so this kind of specialization allows us, if my cat is unwell, I want to go to somebody who can tell me what's up. Unfortunately, my cat isn't great at communicating what's up. So trying to find somebody who's got that knowledge is really powerful. The counterpoint to that is I read an article quite recently that suggested that they've got this new AI thing that was better at diagnosis than most doctors, and that was kind of an eye-opener in terms of accuracy of diagnosis. So is AI the future custodian? Again, I raised that idea maybe. And there was the maths article we didn't get time to talk about. AI is checking all these mathematical proofs and apparently doing a good job at it. But,
Yes.
I would say though, the other part of that question, Nishant, is doctors hold great responsibility, and this is where the peer review process in the validation of medical studies to safeguard patient safety in how trials are conducted, in how data is collected and interpreted so that it is not manipulated in order to prove something we'd all love to be true but may not be, and that can have implications for what drugs are developed and or if a drug is a pharmaceutical compound or drug is maybe going to be very expensive to develop, if there is compelling knowledge that really helps scientists and medical experts understand its value, then it will be funded and prescribed. So the whole peer review process, it has to help the doctors make good decisions, but also safeguard what we consider to be knowledge that goes back to the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm.
Any other questions? Yeah. All right, sweet. Thank you, panelists. We can clap for ourselves. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.